Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our online program. This is Lindsay Buckman from Seaton Street Press, and we are presenting our recent publication, Like the Delayed Rays of a Star by Heather M OBrien, as part of Printed Matter and Exile Books Publishers Platform for the NANA Miami Art Fair. Seaton Street is an artist-run independent artist books and publications project based in Philadelphia. We publish titles that examine the intersections of sight, language, and memory, including archival histories, social identities, and geographies. Before we begin our program, I'd like to thank the Printed Matter Affairs team for everything they do to make this type of programming possible. I would also like to take a moment to introduce O'Brien's work in addition to brief bios of our contributors. Like the Delayed Rays of a Star contemplates the role of the gaze in photography, while attempting to pierce the propaganda surrounding US-centric perceptions of Beirut. Heather M OBrien's work immerses the viewer into her domestic space through sun-drenched portraits from her Ottoman-era home. The images aim to question the misplaced anxieties of what it means to grow up in a post-9/11 image landscape, to live and work in Lebanon, and give birth to one's first child in Beirut on August 4th, the same day as the catastrophic 2020 Beirut explosion. The photographs confront this rhetoric and conditioned fear by documenting a confluence of perfume, smoke, fruit, flowers, baking bread, and exhaust fumes, with the subtleties of passing time ruptured by light. These nuanced moments draw inward, decentering the authorial lens, intentionally shifting how mediated photographs affect one's community. In moments charged by Beirut's 2019 rebellion, economic collapse, the pandemic, and the most recent 2020 blast, this work seeks to resist narrative tropes of a Western gaze by asking us, will there ever be another way to see Beirut? I also want to take a moment to just introduce the contributors of this project and the folks who are on the line as panelists today. Heather M OBrien is an artist, filmmaker, and assistant professor of cinema and photography at Southern Illinois University. Her work seeks to build encounters around issues that impact cultural imagination, from familial archives to the illusion of accurate memory. Recent exhibitions and screenings include Beirut Lab 1975, 2020, or again, Rubbed Smooth, A Moment in Time, Sejura, University Art Galleries, University of California, Irvine, California. Double Helix, Sursak Museum, Beirut, Lebanon, Limited Access 8, New Media Society, Tehran, Iran, and In Search of Lost Time, the International Center of Photography, New York, New York. From 2006 to 2020, Heather was an assistant professor in the Department of Fine Arts and Art History at the American University of Beirut. Yasmine Nishabetan Taan is an associate professor of art and design practice and theory at the Lebanese American University. Her research interest focuses on gender representation in photographs of the Middle East and North Africa region, and on compiling and analyzing data in prominent Arab designers, illustrators, and typographers of the 1960s and 70s. She is author of Helmi El-Tuni, Evoking Popular Arab Culture, and Abdul Qadir Arnout, Designing as Visual Poetry, 2017, that was funded by the DHS Design History Society Research Grant. Salaroda Choucair, Modern Arab Design and Exploration of Abstraction Across Materials and Functions, 2019. Her recent publication is Reading Marie Alcazan's Photographs, Gender Photography, Mandate Lebanon, 2020. Corinne May Botz is a Brooklyn-based artist and educator whose work engages with themes including space, gender, trauma, and the body. Her published books combining photography and writing include The Nutshell Studies of Unexplained Death, 2004, and Haunted Houses, 2010. Botz's photographs have been internationally exhibited at such institutions as the Brooklyn Museum, Museum of Contemporary Photography, Day at Pell, Turner Contemporary, Bellwether Gallery, and Ben Ruby Gallery. Her work has been reviewed in numerous publications such as the New York Times, the New Yorker, Film Magazine, Hyperallergic, Book Forum, and Time Light Books. She is on the faculty of International Center of Photography and John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Juli Carson is professor of art, critical theory, and curatorial practice at the University of California, Irvine, where she is also the director of the University Art Galleries. From 2018 to 19, she was Philippe Joubray Professor of Art History and Curating in the Department of Fine Art and Art History at the American University of Beirut. Her books on the convergence of psychoanalysis, hermeneutics, and conceptual art include Exile of the Imaginary, Politics, Aesthetics, Love, 2007, The Limits of Representation, Psychoanalysis and Critical Aesthetics, 2011, and The Hermeneutic Impulse, Aesthetics of an Untethered Past, 2019. She's also author of the website pharmacon.art. which hosts the Life Worth Living series, a rotation of conversations around filmmakers, artists, and scholars on contemporary cultural phenomenon, as well as an archive of Carson's select exhibitions and essays. So to begin this conversation, I wanted to ask Heather the opening question, and followed by every contributor of this project to then engage around the central themes of her work. So I think as a starting point, I wanted to come back to your closing essay titled "In Attempt to Pierce the Propaganda, Running Parallel Through Space and Time," as it hints at your work's intention of rupturing perceptions of Beirut, where you resided while making this project. As a starting place, could you tell us about the framing of your artist book and its connection to Trinity Minhaj's idea of speaking nearby?
Thank you, Lindsay. I just wanted to thank Printed Matter and also Lindsay for putting this lovely talk together. And it's so amazing to see friends and colleagues from all over the world. We managed to get a time zone that worked for all of us. And thank you to Juli, Corinne, and Yasmine for participating and really making this a collaborative project. I see it that way, very much so. So thanks for that question, Lindsay. I think it's a nice way to sort of frame our conversation today. And I think that, you know, as you all know, I resided in Beirut during the duration of this project. And I think an important part of it was really working with a Lebanese designer on the book named George Hanna, which I was kindly introduced to by Yasmine as he was a student of hers, and working with someone in Lebanon was very, very important to the project. I think that, you know, giving up a little bit of authority was important, something that Juli constantly reminds me of, and I'm thankful for, to kind of hand over a little bit of, when we see photographs, we're so kind of immersed in them ourselves. And I'm sure, Corinne, you can relate as a fellow photographer, to kind of let George have a voice in this work was really, really important to me, to kind of just give him the images and see what he did in terms of the framing, in terms of leaving space between certain images, in terms of, you know, having blank spaces or having, you know, full frame images or smaller images. And I think, to me, the idea of Trinity Minhaj's speaking nearby, it's something I've quite often thought about ever since I was studying with Michelle Dizon, who is now Latipa, and we did an event together with Juli back in 2019, before the world changed, that was called "The Place from Which One Speaks." And that idea of speaking nearby, especially as an American living in Beirut, was really important to me. That I really made sure and struggled ethically with what it means to make work in a place that you're not from. But I was still very eager to make something. And I think that notion of speaking nearby instead of speaking about was very, very important to the work. And I think that, you know, I was very conscious of the images that we normally see of Beirut, growing up in this post 9/11 image landscape. As you said, it really came clear to me. You know, I was born in 1983, the same year as the Beirut barracks bombings. And I think that growing up with rhetoric of Reagan and you know, the 90s, followed by, you know, this event 9/11, really conditioned in my mind a certain image of Beirut that I was very, very adamant to go against. So hopefully that makes sense, and I'm happy to talk about that more, but I think it's a really important question. So thank you.
Thank you, Heather. I think picking up on that, I wanted to come to Juli's contribution and her essay, which is the opening essay titled "Empires of the Gaze." And Julie, you begin with "What is a home?" as the book's central question. I was wondering if you could expand on your interpretation of the role of the home in Heather's work, the use of the protagonist I, as well as Roland Barthes' punctum.
I should say that, first of all, that I wrote the preface while Heather and I were conceiving of the book as a show. And so I was trying to think of a hook, a metaphoric hook in the entire project of Heather's work as a book that would translate to a three-dimensional installation. And so there really are three spaces for me that are hinged together in Heather's project. The first, of course, is the home that is in Beirut and off of Hamra. And that space that's captured photographically, that space of a real thing that is there now still, hinges in, through the book into a three-dimensional space in a gallery, in Irvine at UCI. And so, there's a series of interiorities represented that, pivot from the original house as it's represented in a book, and that we wanted the viewer to experience phenomenologically in real time. So it's interesting, Heather and I spoke a lot about what is a house, and I was suggesting that she and I read together Bachelard's The Poetics of Space, where he speaks at length about how a house is at once a crypt and a transparency. It contains things that are hidden in oneself and of the past, and it actually exposes oneself to the public, in a way. And I really thought Heather's work intuitively was being produced through those years, going from the house as crypt to transparency, and that journey of documentation of the house that happened in real time without knowing the end. How could one have ever known the end? To me, read in turn very much like Camera Lucida reads, which has two parts to it. And this is something Heather and I read together again. I mean, just privately, we would said, like, why don't you read this thing? And I'm going to reread this thing. And then we would get together, right? And we would just talk about the work. And I was also moved by the references of the punctum, what I'm calling punctum 1 in Camera Lucida, which is a detail that later he recants in part 2, saying it's not a detail at all. It's the atemporality of the anterior future, when he's looking at a photograph of a young assassin and says, I shake like a Winnicott's patient of a tragedy that has yet to come, meaning that the individual is dead and he is going to die at the same time. The paradox of temporality, that there, the here now, and this will have been of a photograph. And this again is just very intuitive. I'm not at all implying that Heather, how could she have, was illustrating either Bachelard or Camera Lucida, but as a theorist and a curator and a writer, I'm constantly reading projects intertextually with other works, not as an illustration, but as a performative. So this is the book displayed in the gallery. And then this is just opening the book. So this is what you just saw where the book is. That would be, if I'm standing and I'm looking in, that's behind me, the book. So you come in the gallery, and if you look right, you get this installation. If you look left, you get the book display on the wall. So the exhibition really is in 3 parts. And the first part to the right is a section adapted from the book, which is nerve-wracking for the protagonist, which is what I kept telling Heather she was in this story, is nerve-wracking as it is for all of us going abroad, particularly to Beirut, and the crisis of representation as a representation maker that Heather put herself in, this notion of the here and elsewhereness of being in Beirut, having studied with Sekula and Rosler and Dizon and others, Latipa. And it's very narrative about, and very hopeful still about, what is a place, what is a space. And as you turn, things start, the revolution starts happening, the October 17th revolution. And then to the very far left of the back wall is the faded day of birth and blast. And to the left is the aftermath. And I really saw that the photographs in the book, when I was reading it through the, I'll say, gaze and gauze, as it were, of camera lucida, the sort of punctum one of details, these poignant images with something in them that would make them stick to our gaze, really was indicative of the pre-revolution and pre-blast moment, and then the post-blast moment where an actual trauma comes to abide, but also a miracle of birth comes to be, is really where punctum number 2 comes in. And for us, I wanted to create the viewer to be simultaneously in Heather's home, in Heather's book, in this space, and obliquely in a real live enactment performatively of the Lucida experiment. And that's where I'll leave it for now.
Heather, I wanted to come back to, like, with that kind of framing around the exhibition, I think it's appropriate to come back to how you were making your work, both through the experience of photography, but also in the writing. So something that's really prominent in your project is that these fragments of light are captured all throughout the imagery, but also captured in the moments of absence. The way that the book is broken up, there's a lot of negative space, there's movement, and your writing also lets us into this momentary lapse in memory, textual references, and questions of futurity. So I'm wondering, how does the form of your writing connect to your process of photography and approach to photographing within your book?
Yeah, I think it's a nice segue. I think that, you know, the photographs came first. And, you know, I was to be honest, I was quite hesitant to include text, but there was something, I think, especially after the explosion on August 4th, there was something that was really lacking for me in the images that I needed context. I mean, this project started back in, I want to say 2018. So it's been a long time coming. And I think working with Juli, I think there was something that we talked quite a lot about in terms of trauma and how one makes work during a moment of trauma and a continued trauma, really, because the trauma, I mean, in Beirut, for us that were living there, really started on October 17th, 2019, and is continuing to this day. So yeah, I think that's a long-winded way of saying that I felt the writing was absolutely necessary in terms of giving context to the images, but it also was important to place it after. And this is something, again, that Juli and I discussed at length, kind of this after-before idea that she's worked a lot on in her work. And I think that there was something important to the writing in terms of just, it wasn't, of course it was edited, but there was something a little bit more fluid for it that I think was inspired very much by books like Moira Davies' book that Corinne and I talk about a bit in the text. And this notion of kind of call and response that, of course, you know, having studied with people like Rosler and Sekula, who think a lot about image and text, there's a reference there, but there's also a little bit of a shift, I think, in terms of how I was thinking about text and image. And there was also in the installation a clear, you know, decision not to place the text in a frame with the images. Like, this is something Juli and I talked a lot about, this timeline where you could kind of come in and out of images, and that it was this almost experience that you would see in Beirut. For those who have been there, know that there's this notion of the poster that's very much in and around the city. So this fluidity in terms of the images kind of could come off the wall, and they're not as precious. But I think that, to go back to your question about this notion of the future, I think the text functions very much as the future in a way. Like the images are these past kind of years that I spent in this home, and then the text is kind of referring to what ends up happening. So hopefully that answers the question, and I'll leave it at that.
If I could ask one more about futurity, because it sort of naturally came up as you were describing it, is the end of your book is a question about seeing Beirut in the future. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that in connection to what you just said.
I mean, it's a tough question, and an emotional one for me. It was very hard to leave Beirut for me. I was not ready to go, as many are not. And so I think that, I don't know. I mean, I don't know where it will land. I know that I'm committed to Beirut as a place, as an important place in my life and the life of others. How and where this work continues, I'm not sure, given the political situation currently and the social situation in Beirut. But yeah, I think it's something I have to think more about. I mean, I'm not really sure, given the context of what's happening there currently, with fuel crisis, with lack of medicine, lack of shelter. It's a very dire situation, one that continues to spiral downwards. I've talked to many friends who, when the blast happened, and maybe Yasmine can touch on this as well, since she was there. I think for many of us, I thought that was the end, perhaps. The deepest you could fall, we could say, but it's clearly not. So I think it's a bit pessimistic, of course, but I think it's real in terms of how art and life really come together and bounce back and forth towards each other. And going back to Juli's notion of what makes life worth living, I think this work was absolutely essential for my well-being, and just to find a way to continue through this continued trauma and crisis.
Thanks, Heather. I think it's helpful to have that information, especially as I'm about to ask Yasmine a question that I think picks up on affect a bit, that pertains to what you're describing. And yes, I appreciate your response. Yasmine, in your essay towards the end of Heather's book, Photography or the Art of Documenting Affect, you write about Heather's photos as giving the impression of being studies of light and shadow, but upon a second probing, containing social and emotional layers and the passing of time and affect. So I was wondering if you could speak about your essay's interpretation of shadow, duality, and the post-Lebanese Civil War image landscape that you unpack in her work.
Sure, thank you, Lindsay, for the question. I'm going to try to take it from there, but I wanted to start by reflecting on my experience of seeing the photos while living in Beirut and seeing them again at a time when I am no longer living in Beirut anymore. So, and I feel that there's a certain visual experience, a visuality that is different here. So the photos in a way raise questions on subjects related to domesticity, locality, traveling, or more precisely being displaced. And these photos allow for different visual experience depending on locality and the passing of time. Feelings of longing for a place and questioning, like Heather, whether we need to belong to one place or we don't. I mean, this is a question that comes back to me while I am away. So the spatial and temporal dimension that is expressed in the making as well as in the visuality of the photos produce feelings of longing for a place and time that no longer exist. And I think this is what bothers maybe Heather and, us, the people who left, that we in a way miss this, or we in a way long for this place that does not exist anymore, this time and place. So I see in the photos a kind of visuality that transcends the visual. They evoke not only visual details, but also olfactory and sensory memories of a place. Emotions emanate from the photos through the texture, the sound, the smell of living in the city, in this case, Beirut. All these senses are powerfully transmitted through Heather's lens in her book. And now that we see a glimpse of the exhibition, it's also in the exhibition. It is as if these photos are trying to stop or freeze moments of Heather's life, and at the same time putting an end or attempting to slow down the fast pace of this escalating burden of living conditions that are gradually becoming unbearable, as Heather described it. Heather's photos in the book depict Beirut not as a tangible place, but they evoke the smell, atmosphere, sound through the placement of light and shadow within their frames. The capturing of light and shadow in Heather's work takes different shapes, forms, lines in some photos, spots, circles. We can also see textures, dim light or dim shadows, bright light. The overwhelming presence of the light and shadow in the photos leads us to think that it is almost as if the subject is not the object represented in the photos, but the distribution of light and shadow within its frame. The subject is not the pigeon, nor the nest, nor the egg, not the view from the window. I'm just, giving examples of what we see in the photo, but the rays of light's reflection on the surfaces and their emotional effect on the viewer. In these photos, it seems that many untold stories are being told simultaneously through the play of shadow and light, personal stories about an intimate experience of space and time. The fact that in some photos we see the same interior and the same scenery with different shadows is telling about the photograph's intention, the photographer's intention to represent the passage of time. The shadows here are telling a different story in adding another layer to the already established narrative using abstract forms shaped by the shadows in Heather's interior space to articulate her inner self, as Julie just mentioned. The shadow is metaphorically expressing a void, an erasure, a repressed feeling, a trauma, that which is not there anymore. Just like the rays of light sweeping their way through the window, the viewer, us, is also invited to penetrate Heather's intimate interior space. This creates a moment of discomfort, a tension to want to look more into one's personal life without being impertinent. I speak about duality in my text and this constant movement of light and shadow, at times shadow erasing light and at other times light erasing shadows. This not only creates an interesting movement in the photo, but it also metaphorically enact or depict oxymoron that describe Beirut's schizophrenic atmosphere of silent screams, contrasting conscious, subconscious reality and dreamlike vision, private and public spaces, the fast but at the same time slow pace of Beirut's rhythm, a dead life, Beirut as Heather describes it, a beautiful, terrifying experience. Its strength and weaknesses, its apocalyptic lives of the Beirutis oscillating between womb and tomb, as Heather mentioned at the beginning of the book. So Beirut has a bittersweet after effect that Heather was able to depict in the photos. And just if I may add a few words here on the post-Lebanese civil war image landscape from the first photo shared in this book, we see buildings, air conditions, hanging laundry. The book drives us through a journey into Beirut's intimate, sensual, and not so perfect life, a feeling of an unbearable lightness of being, fleeting moments, unsettled, fragile, vulnerable moments that might take a different trajectory at any time. And I think you asked Heather about the ending of the book, and I think I have a similar answer. These photos present us with this haziness of Beirut, a post-Civil War city depicted through its light and shadow that are left open for yet another interpretation. I think I'm going to add this end here.
Thank you, Yasmine. It's so helpful to hear people's interpretations of how light shapes this work. And continuing with that, I also have a question for Corinne, picking up on the role of light. And at the end of the book, there's a conversation between you and Heather, Corinne, in the Views from Home conversation. And you comment on how light can communicate place and narrative in photographs, interpreting crumpled sheets as a landscape containing past and future for viewers to potentially project onto. The two of you also discuss Heather's relationship to interiority and the specificity of interiority connected to the class that you had taught, Views from Home, at ICP. So I was wondering if you could talk about the connection of that class to Heather's book.
Yes, I'd love to. And also, I just want to say thanks for including me in this, and Heather, congratulations. So yeah, I've been teaching Views from Home for over a decade, and it really comes out of my own practice and research. I've always considered domestic space to be like the most powerful domain. And the home is this entry into memories, politics, desires. It's both a fictional and a lived reality. So the course looks at home from a lot of different viewpoints. In fact, going back to Julie's talk, we start with Bachelard's Poetics of Space, reading an excerpt of that and thinking about notions of interiority and this phenomenological significance of the house. We move on to consider artists and thinkers that explore themes of uncanny, homelessness, exile, looking at the work of Chantal Ackerman, Michael Rakowitz, Rachel Whiteley, Maggie Nelson. And I'm always looking for ways to expand the home beyond that of this heteronormative space. And I think one of the main takeaways for the students in the class is to see how their own personal experiences in everyday life might make their way into their practice and become a bigger story. And Heather's book is such an amazing example of this. You know, you have these really beautiful, intimate images of her apartment in Beirut that are a response to sort of the chaos of settling into this space as an outsider, but it also expands beyond that into like ways of contending with image making and ideologies or preconceptions of Beirut, you know, produced by the West or our imagination. So I think as we see in Heather's work, you know, this dichotomy between the personal and the political, public and private, exterior and interior, you know, it just falls because they're so interconnected, these domains. And you know, one thing I love in Heather's work is how you can always feel the presence of the outside, whether it's just literally infiltrating by like, you know, photographs of the bird or the buildings outside or neighbors, laundry hanging out to dry. But we also see the pass through photographs that she takes from her own personal archive of houses and places from her life. And that actually goes back to the work that Heather made in my course about her brother and addiction and exploring that through family photography. So I think there's this like, to me, sort of psychogeography in Heather's images, which feels even more prescient because of COVID-19 lockdowns that we all experienced. You know, just like in Heather's images, we move through childhood homes and channels sort of the chaos of the outside world from our imagination. And, you know, these over the past few years, so much within this overdetermined interior space that we inhabit. And, you know, our conversation I had with Heather took place before the 2020 explosion in Beirut, but the images are even more politically charged now with that narrative, of course. I think one of the interesting things about teaching the Views from Home course at ICP is that the students are coming from around the globe and they have different cultural understandings of home. So most of the students are living in like temporary New York City apartments. So notions of dwelling, transient, they're all like themes in the class. And Heather's work comments so much on this idea of belonging and foreignness. I think it's like this beautiful exploration of like psychologically dealing with moving to Beirut by turning her camera inwards and creating this world. And as I like in our conversation I had with Heather, I talked about how I felt that the camera creates distance and also reveals this performance of making a home. And Heather also talks about experiences of moving a lot when she was a child and how in the capitalist system we weren't staying at home in our homes for a long time. So there's just like so many, I think, layers to this work and this and Heather's intense like inner dialogue and now the function of the text with an exhibition and everything. I think it is very generous, like allows so many different points of entry for viewers and for audiences. And this class was an inspiration and that we've had this on blog and I'll be back teaching in person in like a few weeks. And I'm excited to share the book with my current Views from Home students.
Thank you, Corinne. Okay, I want to come towards the end of your book, Heather, and ask about in what you wrote in the text piece that is, I would say, like the framing of the end to the book. You reflect on your friend Valentina's question of whether you were able to make a home. This is something difficult to create, she says, no matter how much we love the idea, theoretically and politically. You write about experiencing the violent images you grew up seeing: smoke, tear gas, water cannons, burning banks, a catastrophic explosion. And you ask us, will there ever be another way to see Beirut? So I was wondering if you could speak about the importance of resisting the Western gaze and the Rainier Maria Rilke quote, let everything happen to you, beauty and terror, as a bookend to your project.
Thank you, Lindsay. And it's so, it means so much, Corinne, by the way, that this has come full circle in a decade to know that, because that's where it all began for me. Your class was so important to just me being an artist at all. And so it means a lot that you're still teaching it and that it's still inspiring students to make work and to think about notions of home. So in terms of your question, Lindsay, I think that there's, this quote that I really thought about a lot, especially on August 4th, let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. It's a quote I've thought about since I was a child, really. And I think that there's something about that day that was so both beautiful and terrifying, as Juli so beautifully called earlier, like kind of this gaze and gauze moment that, this moment where the blast happened was so strangely beautiful. I mean, the colors, the lights, even the color of the explosion itself is like mesmerizing if you watch videos of it. And I think it harpened me back to 1983, actually. And these moments of destruction and chaos, and the ways in which artists use these images, and the Western press, of course, uses them in very spectacular ways. And how do we resist that? Because they are so alluring. And I think, as we saw, especially with the August 4th explosion, the amount of press that it got around the world, it was very bizarre. It was a bizarre experience to live through. And also, as someone who thinks a lot about the ethics of representation, and seeks to be in community with others who think about this question, it's kind of something I want to actually pose back a little bit to the contributors, because I'm curious, of both the images that we've all seen growing up of Beirut and Lebanon, and how do we actually resist this? I mean, one way is making work that doesn't show the spectacle, which I attempted to do. I've of course speak about the spectacle through the writing, and that's clearly there, but I was very careful not to include images of the blast, but more the remnants of it. But even the remnants of it, I was questioning, like, what does it mean to look at shattered glass? Like, we've seen these images before from Beirut. Why do we need to keep seeing them? And then, of course, referencing back the Ariella Alouze civil contract of photography, where she talks about there are moments where we must look, we must know what's happening in the world. So it's something I go back and forth about. I don't think I really have an answer. I think I want to kind of, in closing, kind of pose it back to the participants to see if they have thoughts on it as well.
There's one small passage that I'd like to read that from my essay that addresses what Heather is speaking about, because I am probably a better writer than a speaker. So let me just read this thought, because you might wonder, we didn't say why I called this Empires of the Gaze. I had wanted, when I was telling Heather that I was going to write not a memoir book, but like an essay called Empires of the Gaze about my experience in Beirut, but I could only do it through the other. And I didn't know who the other would be. And when I met Heather again in the States and she did this, I realized that she was the other. So this one passage addresses directly what I would call the not I of the subject. Empire of Signs, conceived during the decolonization of the so-called Orient, is Barth's semiotic poetic reflection on his 1966 trip to Japan, just as the reconstructed country was beginning its re-entry on the international stage. If his travelogue is deconstructive, it's because the foreign traveler here, the journal's protagonist, as it were, engages in a critical self-examination of the Western I embedded in the East. Barth's stance easily recalls Antonio Gramsci's reflection in Prison Notebooks of 1929, later quoted in Edward Said's Orientalism of 1978, that the starting point of critical elaboration is the consciousness of what one really is, and is knowing thyself as a product of this historical process to date, which has deposited in you an infinity of traces without leaving an inventory. But it is imperative at the outset to compile such an inventory. That's Gramsci, end quote. A deconstruction of the travelogue form, then, is really a deconstruction of the self, a process that enacts a kind of laceration of the subject's sovereign I. Barth describes it precisely in those terms, that in laying down the Western gaze, the way one might lay down one's weapons, leaves him the one stared at. Consequently, and this is him from Empires of Signs, consequently, quote, the situation is the very one in which a certain disturbance of the person occurs, a subversion of early readings, a shock of meaning, lacerated, exterminated to the point of its irreparable void, without the objects ever ceasing to be significant, desirable, end quote. And so I think, with me, I really, couldn't have written the preface to the book without working it out in real space, which is what I do. And in that performative journey, in the book and in as manifested in the exhibition, the first laceration of the I in relation to the problematic, the aporia we're all talking about, how to be there, and not be there, not there, we should say, you know, begins with these philosophical problems and this sort of topo analysis, as Bachelard calls it, of by way of doing an inventory of the self in this very sort of explicit ethical manner. And that's before the I is literally lacerated. And I remember when, which constitutes the next 2/3 of the book and the exhibition. And I remember that very well because you, Heather, had left Beirut Lab, the exhibition that you came out to talk in that conference for with Latipa. And I was like, okay, you're going. And I remember saying, can't you just stay longer? And you didn't. And you actually said, my God, I've landed, there's burning tires. It had begun. And that journey is a literal physical laceration of pieces of the self socially. You know, things start to fall apart. The outside that you were not in, but would traverse through, now became really outside, and then COVID, and then the blast. But what's poetic about the book and the installation, which I hope, which is the installation is an homage to the book, not just a manifestation, is that in the third part, the I comes together in that anterior future. So the I itself is, to quote Freud, is very much fort da, you know, gone there, and really needs to be expressed performatively. And so that's what I was seeing in it. And the not I, of course, Heather will recognize, is an appropriation of the phrase not Arab that Walid coined for his special issue of Third Text in talking about that crisis of identity, because it's not just a travelogue crisis, it's a crisis everywhere.
And just for reference, that's Walid Sadek, who's a professor and was a colleague of mine at the American University of Beirut.
One thing that this question of like the ethics of representation made me think about was your film, Heather, the Dyad Gaze, where in our conversation we talk about like your decision to include your personal voice, like you're asking the questions, and even if you're not including your voice, literally just the idea of being aware of where you're speaking from and sort of asking questions of yourself. And I mean, I always think about art making in terms of relationships. Like I oftentimes form close relationships with people through a project, but then there's the relationship with like the audience and showing the work and the conversations that happen with that. But just like, you know, like you said, being aware of your own preconceptions and trying to work through it and knowing that it might be messy, I think it's actually like a really honest, good place to be as an artist or someone thinking about representations, and just like being surprised and letting the world sort of fight back and changing your mind, and yeah, and just like, you know, having this dialogue between, you know, like research and writing and image making, and having it all sort of, I think, come together like in your project in such a beautiful way where it's complicated and complex. And I can relate to that, you know, in my own work as well.
Maybe I can add something about the image of, you know, this image of this explosion, or the photograph of the explosion that we're talking about. That, and I'm just, it's a bit difficult to think about it. I think we need to be more distant from it, and it doesn't seem like we moved forward with it because of the fact that we don't know yet anything about the investigations. But I was just thinking about the way images are being used for political propaganda and how they are being seen by the West, but then how they are being reused by the locals. So on the 4th of August of this year, we saw that the images resurfaced on social media. And this was to remind I don't know, the world that investigation should continue. I mean, I'm just, trying to make sense of the image and how it resurfaces, and for different reasons that, of course, go beyond the aesthetic. I mean, it's more of a revendicating the investigations mostly. Yeah.
I wonder if, Heather, if you or if anyone wants to address, I think it came up in the press release, which I know you and Julie had worked on, this question of the privilege of mobility and migration that I think connects to the ethics of representation. Also, like, as an artist, how do you engage in spaces, but specifically the mobility, if either of you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that came up also with Dizan Latipa in The Place from Which One Speaks. I mean, that's kind of where that originated, that privilege of mobility. What does it mean to be able to go to these places as an American, right? And to have an American passport is very privileged, especially, I mean, we saw it very, very clearly after August 4th, and we continue to see it with the exodus of people leaving Lebanon. And I think it's an important and really pivotal question to remind ourselves, those of us who were able to leave, that it is a true privilege, and what can we do in terms of that privilege of mobility? How do we work with that and how do we counter that? And I'm interested in not just like, fundraising or giving money, which I think is necessary and important in many ways. But what can we do with that voice? And again, that's why I refer back to the speaking nearby. I don't think I would ever be someone who thinks I could speak about Beirut, even though I lived there. But as Dizan Latipa said, there are moments we must speak. The crisis is so urgent, everyone must speak about it. And I felt compelled, as someone who gave birth to a child on Lebanese soil, as someone who lived through that, that I have to speak about it, and we must speak. And it goes back to Julie's life worth living. Like, our silence is not enough. And I think that we just have to continue to be really mindful of both the place from which we're speaking and whose voices we're uplifting, and who's in the room, I guess we could say. And I think that goes back to, again, my clear, I guess we could say it was a true honor to work with George, the designer, even though it was very difficult because he was residing in Lebanon, even, as we were working through the installation and having to deal with moments of, power cuts and electricity, which is very normal if you've lived in Lebanon, but has become much more dire in the past year. And going back to what Corinne said, like, these relationships that actually form in art making, I think are so important, that they're not separate from the politics that are happening on the ground. That's where art and politics, to me, is really one and the same. So maybe that's a long-winded way of talking about it, but I'd be curious if anyone else has thoughts on it as well. I know we're getting close to the end here in terms of time, but
one of the, mobility isn't just a question of where one can go, as we were, and we, over the last year, for a period of time, we weren't allowed to go anywhere. But it's also about, are we in positions, or how do we put ourselves in positions to invite others to come to where we are, to speak nearby us? And that's just one of the mandates of the gallery program that I run, is about having this, not just thinking like an academic, which I am, about which travel grant do I get and where do I go, but actually bringing the world to a local audience through people who themselves are too young or can't or don't yet have an interest in going somewhere. How do you bring the world also into your local space? So I think it's literally not a one-way street.
Are there any other questions that you all want to ask each other, or Heather, things that you would like to ask of people?
I think I would kind of pose a question to Lindsay as an organizer of this event and coming up with such wonderful questions. I'm very grateful for that. I think that I would be curious to hear how your experience was, you know, as someone who has a relationship to Irvine, first of all, where the work was shown, but also, you know, as this is a book form, you know, your experience kind of working through the book and yeah, how do you see it as part of your practice as an educator, as an artist? Because I know bookmaking is really part of your work. That question of the place from which one speaks, and also these notions of privilege of mobility. I'm just curious a little bit to hear your thoughts on all of this.
Yeah, oh, excellent questions, Heather. I think the visibility factor, which visibility is not everything in terms of when we consider like movements of liberation, movements of empowerment, movements of uplifting, that visibility is one layer or like one component, but it is a component that is deeply meaningful because representation does matter, even though representation itself like cannot be misconstrued with liberation. And I think that's something I teach about a lot and something that I consider in publishing. Why does a book matter today in 2021 when so many things are digital and we don't technically need books to learn information? But I'm a person who publishes books and I think that they still matter, even though you can also use digital technologies. It's not to say that by publishing, it means everyone will come into an encounter with the book, but this idea of mobility that Julie brings up with the idea that you could be in a gallery, you could be in a local venue and people could come, and it's an invitation into that space. I think that's why I publish still, even though I know it's not the most pragmatic way to technically produce content. I still believe that it is, or I still believe that there's so much value in the book as an object that can create publics. I'm influenced by Michael Warner's text on publics specifically, and this idea of counter publics and the way in which books become these devices that have multiple roles in community. So I think if I were, you know, to answer your question, maybe most succinctly is to say that I think there's power in books and their ability to be distributed and disseminated, and the history of the printing press as an active agent for change and collective voice. And for all of these efforts, hopefully in creating more dialogue and communication around issues that are not as visible in society. I think that's what artist books and publications do well. It's part of why I run an independent press, that it doesn't fall within the mainstream publishing industry and that there's a whole community of publishers, which is why we're doing this program, because it's part of that people are trying to talk about issues that we may not be seeing reflected in other more dominant spaces. So I think that the book, in this case, both in the gallery installation, as well as the book object, has an invitation to many publics. Obviously, the locality of Irvine being a space, I'm from Orange County and grew up in Orange County, and I'm currently doing research out of UCI myself, and understand that the politics of representation in a place like Orange County with issues in Beirut are probably not the common conversation that's happening in Orange County, and how important it becomes, even more so in some cases than a large city, to be having those conversations in the suburbs of Orange County, which is historically a pretty conservative place where these conversations are not just dinner table conversations. So I think that there's also power in that. How are you kind of shaking up or shifting ground that has not been unsettled enough? Would be why the installation matters too. But I think the book and the installation do different things. And I think you need both of them in art making, that it sometimes, you know, going beyond the book is also an important part of how, as artists, we change the landscape.